Meanwhile, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is playing down President Trump's Afghanistan rhetoric. The secretary spoke yesterday, emphasizing efforts to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan.
He also said Afghan forces will hopefully soon start seeing battlefield victories, and the U.S. Air Force is helping troops accomplish that. Charlie D'Agata takes a closer look at the fight in Afghanistan from the air.
It may not look like a modern aircraft. Then again, the Afghan military's long fight against the Taliban could hardly be described as a modern war.
What they're missing.
And Brigadier General Philip Stewart says it just might break the stalemate here.
This is a country that screams out for air power. That doesn't have a whole lot of roads. It's mountainous.
And that terrain suits the new Afghan fighter division, which consists of 12 American-built A-29 planes and about 24 MD-530 attack helicopters, capable of delivering a full payload. Heavy machine guns, and guided missiles. U.S. combat pilot Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Green is in charge of handling Afghanistan's top guns.
All the communication is on them.
The guy on the ground here's the target, speaking to the pilot in the cockpit.
All in their own language. That is all on them.
So is the maintenance. Because the A-29 uses the same kind of engine found in planes like Cessnas, they're easy to fix. It says something about the security situation here. The pilots don't want to be identified. But he said it's the Taliban who have new reasons to be fearful.
At the first, they were like laughing at this. It's just like this is the World War style airplanes.
Yeah, World War II style, right. He said that was until they found themselves on the receiving end of one in combat.
After that, they said we should hide.
So now they hide when they hear you coming.
They are hiding, yes.
They're also capable of dropping laser-guided 500-pound bombs, which makes them both cheap and deadly.
An aircraft like this is not going to hold its own against an air force like the Russians or China.
Sure. It's not designed to. Is there a need to have advanced aircraft? No, not in this theater. This suits the Afghan Air Force just fine.
So it makes it a pretty unfair fight.
We hope so, in our favor, right? So that's the desire.
And it's a mission on fast forward. Afghan pilots come right out of U.S. training and straight into combat. With the Taliban gaining ground, the only advantage they've got is above it.
CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is with me now from Kabul, Afghanistan. Charlie, how will President Trump's new strategy directly impact the Air Force there?
Well, it's a big part of the new strategy. It's already been outlined by Afghan officials that we've spoken to. I mean, you have seen that report, and it really doesn't look like much, and it isn't much in terms of the fighter aircraft, but they're hoping to bulk up that system. But what we didn't really report on there is there are other parts of that, mainly cargo, surveillance, other aircraft that are part of bulking up or ramping up the U.S. Air Force the Afghan Air Force that the Americans are really taking a very progressive role in. And one of the reasons is the terrain. You may not be able to see it. It's a very hazy day here, but this country is so mountainous. It makes it beautiful, but it makes it difficult because the Taliban, they use this terrain to launch these strikes, and the Afghan forces just can't bring in reinforcements quick enough. Well, this is a game changer because of that, because if you can get aircraft in, you can get weapons in, you can get people in. It is a fundamental part of the new war strategy going forward.
So there has to be some risks, though. We're talking about ramping up air power, increasing attacks on the Taliban. What about civilian casualties?
Emery, there are always risks whenever you have an air campaign. And it's worth noting here that U.S. Air Force officials stated that they're not only looking at ways of expanding the Afghan Air Force, but they're looking at ways of perhaps increasing U.S. airstrikes, increasing U.S. air power here. As we have witnessed ourselves in places like Iraq and in Syria, whenever you use air power, you've got to be aware of the civilian population, and the Taliban are strategic. They've been fighting here for so long. They know how to hide. They know how to hide among the civilian population. They know how to strike from a building and then get out of that building before airstrikes can be brought in. So yes, it is certainly a concern, especially in this country that strategically it's harder to pinpoint air assets in a place that is so mountainous when you've got an insurgent group that is so mobile as the Taliban. It's not quite the same as fighting, say, ISIS in Mosul, where you got flat lands, you have a city center, and that makes it difficult in its own way. But this provides or establishes a whole different scenario as far as air tactics, not only, of course, from U.S. air assets, but of Afghan air pilots who simply don't have the kind of experience that Americans do.
So you say that, you know, it's easy for the Taliban to hide amongst civilians. Is this the kind of war, then, that can be won from the air when you consider that the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they typically, fight from the ground, they create roadblocks, suicide bombs. Can we win this war from the air?
It can't be won from the air for several reasons. It can be held from the air. One of the reasons is we have to remind our American audience that the Taliban have now taken over 40% of the country. Now, I have to sort of define that in better terms. What that means is they have freedom of movement in these areas. If you go down south, as we've done in Helmand, you got these large stretches of desert and mountainous areas. That means the Taliban can move in between those areas. So they can do things like set up roadblocks, they can hide and then reappear. The only way to drive out an insurgent group like that is with using ground forces. Now, the Afghans are capable of doing that, but Air Force and air supply and reinforcements, even if it's suppression fire, as they call it here, if you bring in a couple of these aircraft, close air aircraft like the helicopters, if you have troops that are engaged in a ground fight, you then bring in the helicopters or even the fixed-wing aircraft that you maybe see in that piece to just lay down fire to try to take out the Taliban in that area. Then you take over that territory. So no, this cannot be won by air alone. No fight can be. But specifically this area, especially Taliban-controlled areas in the south where they have freedom of movement over these large expanses of desert, that can only be taken by territorial acquisition. The only way they can do that is for Afghan forces to push the Taliban out.
So we're talking about beating back the Taliban, regaining more land for the Afghan government, or taking control of more land for the Afghan government. But then what happens after that? Is there a plan for peace in this country?
That is the key question, Anne-Marie. That's what Americans will be asking. That's what Afghans will be asking. You know, when President Trump said we're not going to put a deadline on the presence of the U.S. military here, it's because he doesn't want to put up any flags for the Taliban. The last time that happened during the surge of 2009, 2010, 11, the Taliban just kept their powder dry. They're not going to fight 100,000 U.S. forces because they're going to lose, and they're going to lose their reinforcements. So they just waited out the clock, then came back full force, and we saw what happened there. What this program is all about, and it has to do a lot with accountability and conditions on the ground, is actually like a $6.5 billion program looked at bulking up the Afghan Air Force so that it can stop relying on U.S. air power. Now, and that program is supposed to be finished by 2023. When we speak to American Air Force officials and military officials on the ground, they said, you know what, if we've done our job right, we're actually putting ourselves out of work here. You hear it time and time again. What they're trying to do is to get the Afghan Air Force to stand on its own and to bring in their own air assets so they don't have to rely on air power. Because I'm telling you, when you speak to Afghan commanders on the ground, you say, look, if you had a wish list, what would you want more than anything? Air power, airstrikes, surveillance, medevac, helicopters. Everything is coming from the air. Now, there's no way you can get the Afghan Air Force anywhere near the capability of the American Air Force here, but it could get close. And the Taliban are paying attention. Spoke to an Afghan pilot who said they were laughing at those planes. They look a little bit silly. It's kind of World War II technology. They said, but they stop laughing when they see them in action, because then they come in lying low and fire at these positions. You know what? They're just as effective as an F-16 flying at a great height of 30,000 feet in terms of getting rid of that enemy.
Charlie D'Agata, thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.